name's Benjamin Perry. I'm here with Joseph Lam. He is the author of Patterns of Sin in the Hebrew Bible, um, Metaphor, Culture, and the Making of a Religious Concept. It's a book that talks broadly about the different ways that specifically the Hebrew Bible talks about sin. It's very, very interesting. Really gets into a lot of the differences in terms of metaphor, in terms of language. Joseph, maybe you could explain a little bit more the background behind your book.
Yeah, thanks. This book was sort of motivated, I guess, by a desire to get at some of the early development of sin as a concept, as an idea. Being a scholar of ancient literatures and languages and cultures, the natural place for me to go was the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. These texts that obviously are still read in our modern culture, but have these ancient roots. So the book basically looks at the major metaphors that are used to speak about sin within the Hebrew Bible. And I find in those texts 4 recurring metaphors. So just quickly, sin as burden. So sin imagined or talked about as an object that the sinner carries and sometimes weighs down on the sinner and has to be removed for that responsibility of the sin to be removed. Second metaphor is sin as an account. So God sort of imagined as a heavenly king keeping records of good and bad deeds. The third set of metaphors is sin as path or direction. So all the various metaphors that speak of sin as either walking in sin or turning away from sin, various paths of sin, anything that speaks of sin as kind of mapping it onto a kind of landscape in which a moral agent travels. And then the fourth is sin as stain or impurity. So I explore various aspects of the relationship between sin and the language of purity and impurity. And so what I see is that kind of in the combination of these 4 metaphorical ways of speaking and thinking, the emergence of something that begins to approach what we think about when we talk about sin today.
Yeah, I think that's a great synopsis of the book. One of the things that was really interesting to me was you're just dealing with metaphors in general, and you're pointing out that oftentimes once a metaphor is used enough, it ceases to really function as a true metaphor and just becomes a turn of phrase. And I think that's something that's super obvious to us when we're using language now, and people don't tend to in contemporary terms ascribe huge amounts of meaning to the etymology behind phrases like a dead ringer. Like it's interesting that used to refer to it like that bell that people would put next to grave sites in case somebody was dead, but nobody when they're actually using that phrase today, nobody goes, oh well, they're probably thinking etymologically of this ancestral referent to burial practices. And like you said, if someone uses the word sinister, no one's going to say, oh well, they must have been subconsciously thinking about left-handedness, because that's where the etymology of the word comes from.
Right.
And yet there's this whole culture in academia of doing the exact same thing with ancient speech and saying, oh well, clearly this word comes from such and such etymology, and therefore there's all this meaning and subtext that's packed within it. And so I thought it was really interesting you sort of pointing out a little bit of the absurdity of making that claim that like somehow ancient cultures were using language with this with full knowledge of this sort of rich etymology, when in fact I would assume that ancient cultures were probably even less aware of etymology than we are today, given the relative lack of education and systematic analysis of language, things like that. But you are running against this real current that's running in academia. Like, have you found pushback against that idea that some metaphors may just be turns of phrase and don't really have a wealth of etymological meaning behind them?
Or if it does to this point, not a lot of pushback. We'll see. I mean, as more people continue to read the book, what further reactions I get. I mean, this is, it's a very interesting point you bring up. This was a lot, a lot of these points I encountered when first approaching the book. In writing this book, I essentially had to learn about metaphor theory, all the kind of latest developments. A lot has been done in the last few decades in terms of research on metaphor by linguists, psychologists, cognitive scientists, all manner of scholars across a wide range of fields have turned their attention to the phenomenon of metaphor and just sort of seen how central it is. But you're right. I mean, at this kind of detailed linguistic level, metaphors can be live or dead. I mean, that itself is a metaphor for talking about metaphors, but I think it's a useful one. And when we turn to ancient texts, the main difference is we're not native speakers of these languages, right? I mean, so for modern languages, we have an intuitive sense of whether certain phrases are being used metaphorically or literally. There's a way of giving an account of what that is, but normally kind of we have some sense. We read a poem or we read language. We have some intuitive sense of what constitutes literal versus metaphorical language. When we read ancient texts, these languages that take, a lot of decipherment, and we know our knowledge of them is imperfect, we can't rely on our natural intuitions. So, I mean, I think it depends from case to case. There are cases where scholars, I would argue, go astray in terms of kind of imputing more metaphoricalness, right, to the language than probably was present originally or is warranted in terms of our interpretation. At the same time, I wouldn't want to say it's never the case that ancient writers, ancient authors were kind of aware of some of the metaphorical undertones or occasionally the etymologies of words. The other thing we need to keep into account is that a lot of ancient literature in general was produced by a very small proportion of the population, right? The scribal elite. You're absolutely right in saying that, the vast majority of the population probably couldn't read or write at all. But the texts we have come from those who could. And so sometimes, a particular scribe or the particular writer producing a text could be very sophisticated in terms of what they're doing with the language. So it really comes down to a close analysis of the particular text or the particular phrase that's in question.
Yeah, I'd love to get into some of the metaphors that you talk about in the book. And one of the things that really struck me was actually how salient most of the metaphors still are today. I mean, things like talking about sin as burden, talking about sin as a stain, talking about sin as a deviation from a path. Like even, especially within contemporary Jewish and Christian, and I would say also other religions. But even for people outside of religion, just talking about oh, I feel so weighed down by things, or that's a stain that isn't going to wash out. I mean, like those are have become metaphors that are used wholly outside of religious structures as well. One of the questions that I had for you is how much do you think that is just sort of human nature? Is there evidence that these are just metaphors people turn to because they're sort of common facts of what it means to be alive, that like when you carry heavy things, it's kind of a pain, so it's just a natural metaphor to choose, or how much do you think that it actually that that our culture has been shaped by the metaphors used in the Hebrew Bible? Can you tease that apart a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting question. I think it's a difficult question to answer definitively. I mean, I would suspect that the correct answer is a little bit of both, right? I mean, in fact, just speaking on the burden metaphor, in the course of some of my research for the book, I didn't get into a lot of the psychological literature, but there's psychologists out there doing experiments about kind of these metaphors, some of this language, and how it kind of has deeper resonances, like within our cognition and so on, and how perhaps in intuitively we have kind of there's a coherence between metaphors like burden and ideas such as sin. But I would also say, I mean, a lot of it simply has to do with the legacy of these texts within our Western culture and culture in general. I mean, millions of people still read these texts. These texts are alive and well in a wide range of religious communities, Jewish and Christian. As these texts get read and reread, some of these metaphors, right? Because the metaphors I identify, they're pervasive. They show up everywhere in the Hebrew Bible. It's not just one, poem, one phrase in a particular text, but these are metaphors that recur over and over. I think that language seeps in to kind of everyday discourse through the course of, the centuries that these texts have been read and interpreted. So,
is there any evidence from comparative religious study, like if you look at other ancient religions, are there commonalities or differences between the way that other, ancient religious texts that wouldn't have, had communication or been influenced by the Hebrew Bible? Are there, commonalities or differences in the way that they talk about sin, or, if not sin, this similar sorts of, processes of guilt or catharsis, or,
Well, I mean, I haven't done a kind of comprehensive analysis of all kind of the world's religions in that sense. But I would think that, the metaphor of path, for instance, shows up in a lot of religious traditions, right? Kind of a proper religious a set of behaviors imagined as a right path versus a wrong path. That might be kind of a good example of what you were hinting at earlier about certain, basic kind of human intuitions, basic facts about kind of how we imagine the world. There aren't that many ways of speaking about kind of moral agency in a kind of more concise way than mapping it onto the sort of physical landscape. It's something, in the book I discuss just how, once we adopt this language of traveling towards sin, away from sin, a lot of kind of these ideas we associate with sin kind of come into focus. The notion of intentionality, the notion of moral agency, that you can kind of choose which direction to move in. And so that kind of naturally shows up in a lot of other religious traditions as well. So because of kind of how, in some ways how simple these four metaphors are, we do find them in a lot of other contexts.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the reasons why they're enduring. Particularly something like, path, like if you wander off the right path and you get lost, like that's a very visceral, even primal. I mean, and in a lot of ways, like these metaphors do seem to be somewhat innate and primal. That when you carry heavy things, it's a physical burden. It hurts. We do seem to have a real preference for when things are clean, when things are really, really messy. I think most people, or, very, very badly stained, if there's a big stain in the middle of a white canvas, like people don't react to that super well. And not because we've been, conditioned or trained, but I think that there is some sort of just innate preference towards when things are nice and clean and whole and aesthetic. Yeah. I mean, that there's a reason why we have similar aesthetics throughout history. So I think that was one of the things that was really interesting to me is, how much some of these may have endured simply because there is some fundamental quality to being human.
Yeah, that on the stain and purity point. I mean, I got some of that from Paul Ricoeur, the insight from his book, The Symbolism of Evil. I think it's a very key insight that metaphor in particular, that there's almost a pre-rational sense to it, that when you label something a stain or something impure, it almost just forces a reaction right from you. apart
Yeah.
from kind of whatever rational arguments you would want to offer about whether this is a right behavior or wrong behavior. No, that's impure. You're stained. You react to that language in a way that may not be true of some of the other metaphors. So
It's visceral.
yeah, very much so.
Um, would you say that there are so we've talked a little bit about some of the commonalities between, discussion of sin in the Hebrew Bible and the way that we view sin today, or the way that, people tend to relate to sin. What would you say are some of the real differences that you found when you were, looking into how the Hebrew Bible talks about sin? Were there things that you found where, like, oh, that's a real disconnect, that's something that, doesn't necessarily resonate today, that we sort of, dropped off, or that we don't employ as readily?
Yeah, I mean, there are kind of a number of things, and these obviously are rooted in the differences between ancient Israelite culture and modern culture. To start with a more subtle example, one, this is kind of part of the argument of the book as well. In the discussion of sin as an account, I make this distinction between sin as account and sin as debt. So the debt metaphor seems to be what comes more naturally to us when we talk about sin, right? Sin as, when you commit a sin, whether individually or collectively, you incur a debt that then has to be repaid at some point. So that's the kind of language that I think when it does come up in our public discourse or religious discourse, that's the idea that is most natural. Whereas in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, it's not so much quite yet the idea of sin as kind of an individual, sort of a debt that the sinner repays, right? That actually comes later in later Jewish and Christian interpretations subsequent to the Hebrew Bible. The idea alive in the Hebrew Bible is really kind of this idea of God as kind of a heavenly king keeping records and God repaying sin, right? So the repayment is actually not focused on the sinner's responsibility to repay, although I'm not saying that idea would have been completely absent, but the language has to do with, oh, you've sinned. The repayment you're going to get in terms of punishment is going to be commensurate to the sin. So that's just one example.
Yeah, you say in that section that, like, God is expected to return sinful deeds in equivalent measure,
Right.
And that there is this sort of, almost a one-to-one relationship. Like, did you find any allowance for God to forgive sins, or sort of not mete out a fitting punishment, deliver a punishment less than, is worth, or was it really, like, is that more of a modern concept?
Well, no, that is in the Bible. So, but that's also described, couched in the same language. So when God does that, he erases the sin. So we have language in the Psalms particular, God wipes away. I think there, it's not so much the wiping away of a stain as he's erasing, I don't know, a tablet or, kind of ink from kind of an ancient document. Right. Yeah. So it's erasing the record is the language there. So, I mean, God in the Bible reserves the right, I guess, to, just like any ancient king, right, has the choice in any given instance, right, to exercise mercy, kind of to make that particular decision. So really, the other part of the metaphor is God imagined as this ancient Near Eastern monarch, kind of fulfilling the roles and described in the same kind of language that ancient kings or used of ancient kings. So you do see that, but kind of the difference, again, kind of in the ancient versus modern conception has to do with where the focus is. I mean, is it the sinner's initiative to naturally be able to repay the debt? Because once you have this idea of debt, it's not that God is removed from the picture, but kind of the economy, right, of dealing with that sin doesn't primarily depend kind of as much on God as on the individual, right? At least that's not the focus of the language. So there's, more to tease out there, obviously, but that would be one example.
Yeah. I'd like to pivot a little bit and just talk about, maybe some of the more, I don't want to say practical, but experiential aspects of your work. So like when you were writing this and you were, really getting into how the Bible talks about sin, did it actually change the way that you view sin in your own life? Did it, I don't know if you have a particular religious tradition that you're part of, but did it, affect the way that, you view sin within that, or just as, a concept of guilt or, forgiveness?
I mean, I actually would say that the experience of writing this book impressed upon me more so just the power of language in general, the power of metaphor. So, the specific example I used was sin, but the work I did on this book made me more and more aware of the extent to which the metaphors we employ in our daily lives, our religious communities, our public discourse, so often frame kind of realms of discussion in ways that we're often not aware of, but in very powerful ways. So this applies to sin. For instance, so the metaphors we employ matter. So to go back to an example I hinted at earlier, right? Sin as debt, sin as account. In my book, I mention kind of the political discourse. One of the few areas in our public discourse we still regularly use the language of sin, and that's with slavery. And related to that, sometimes the discussion of reparations. Right. So sin, we naturally talk about the sin of slavery, and the discourse sometimes is framed around this issue of sin as a collective debt, right? That that needs to be repaid. So I think being aware of that, being aware that discussion, unlike many other areas of our public discourse, that is framed in terms of this sin as debt metaphor, it's worth considering whether, the application of that metaphor is a productive one. And I think I would argue in this case it is, right? It is productive in the sense that that type of discussion, that type of framing of the issue can lead to a kind of productive debate about, our kind of collective modern lives today, how we deal with kind of the legacy of these issues in our society. This is very, obviously a very contentious issue in contemporary politics and discourse. But so recognizing that there is a metaphor there in the background, kind of makes us aware of the language we're using. Yeah. Hello.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Cut out for a second. And I think that you're right that when you do choose a particular metaphor, it is that, that choice of a metaphor that can have, really illuminating effect in terms of, highlighting underlying, elements of a conversation that aren't necessarily talked about. So specifically talking about, the legacy of slavery through the lens of sin, we're forced to grapple with, in the same way that, sin often has an effect, far reaching beyond the initial action. But, I mean, especially in religious tradition in the Hebrew Bible, you see, the sins of the parents are visited upon the children, right. And that sin is often multi-generational and it's an enduring and can, have an effect far reaching beyond the initial action. I think that, really, when applied to slavery, it highlights a lot of the really problematic aspects, I mean, obviously of the act itself, but more so how much we are still grappling with the very, very real consequences of something that happened, in the 1800s. And you can't just say, oh, well, it happened 150 years ago,
right.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Because, we are very, very, palpably grappling with the fallout of, I would say, probably the worst sin in the history of our nation.
Yeah. Yeah. Just to offer kind of a counterpoint, kind of, so I would say sin as debt in the case of slavery, is, in my view, a productive way of talking about it. One could talk about it in other ways as well. Another area that has, where kind of in writing the book, these ideas have kind of connected with things I've seen in modern discourse, has to do with the language of purity and impurity when applied to sexuality. So that in that case, I would argue. I mean, I think it's less clear cut, right? I mean, potentially, yeah, one could very easily imagine cases where language like that can become very hurtful and damaging. So, I mean, is a rape victim impure, for instance, right? So, recognizing the metaphors we employ, being aware of their implications. Really, in writing the book, that it made me think really deeply about the language. I mean, that is used in the Hebrew Bible, but then by implication, the language I use, the language I encounter. So really, that in terms of how the book has shaped me, that's above all kind of, yeah.
That's something I've been thinking a lot about recently, actually, with the current election, is how much the metaphor, especially, I think it's worse this election cycle than it has been in previous elections that I've paid close attention to. That this metaphor of politics as a fight, that everything's punch, counter punch. It's this real sort of like boxing match or prize fight. On the lead up to all the debate, that was constantly was happening. Will this be the knockout punch for Hillary Clinton? Is Donald? But when you use that kind of metaphor, it does have grave implications for the way that we consider our politics, and particularly, I would say that the way that we consider people with whom we disagree politically.
Yeah.
That if all of a sudden this is not just a political disagreement, but this is a battle, and there's only one winner and there's only one loser, and it's a totally zero-sum game.
Yeah.
I think that metaphor that is increasingly applied is part of the reason why we've reached a stage in our political processing that is largely defined by paralysis and by just vitriol and complete disdain for people with whom we disagree.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really perceptive kind of observation about kind of what's going on right now. And so really, I mean, the kinds of implications for kind of how we think about all areas of our public discourse, recognizing kind of the power of these metaphors, again, the way they frame the discussion in ways that are implicit, right? Often it just comes through in kind of even just the way a headline it shows up, but that's all you need, right? Just the other thing that comes out of this book is once that metaphor is there, kind of often what follows is interpreted, read, understood in light of that initial framing. So, yeah, very much. This is, I think about this stuff all the time. Maybe too much, but yeah.
Sort of to pivot back to the book a little bit. One of the things that I thought was interesting, you have this statement where you said theological systematization must always be preceded, methodologically speaking, by a rigorous attempt to discern the grammatical sense of the text. And related to what we were just talking about, I mean, I think that this has broader implications beyond simply the Hebrew Bible, but really what I think in many ways you make an argument for that we really do have to pay attention to language because language matters, and that we need to really thoroughly analyze the language we're using before we even before we create sort of grand schemes of philosophical systems or whatever else. My question to you is obviously that's great, great reminder for scholars and for ministers and for and that's not the way that a lot of people tend to relate to language. Well,
Right.
I think the majority of people with whom I speak tend to, have, a nice philosophical system in place. And then, the language sort of follows and comes down from that system. And I think particularly with regard to theology, most of when I've worked in churches, most of the people who I talk to, they don't know, they don't know how to read Hebrew. I haven't probably taken any classes on the Bible, haven't, ever done a grammatical analysis of a text or something, and then probably never will. So
Yeah.
how do you bridge that gap? How do you, bring in some of that critical analysis of language that is so illuminating in a way that is both palatable and interesting and informative for somebody who that's just not where they're coming from.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that, even if we can't teach everyone biblical Hebrew, as much as I teach biblical Hebrew, and I'm always welcoming of more students in my classes. I recognize that that's not a practical reality. I think it's on the onus of scholars and pastors and leaders of these religious communities who do have access, who do kind of do a lot of this more detailed work or have interaction with it, to make that available, to translate it, to kind of make to make some of these ideas more accessible. This is kind of a persistent problem, right? One looks at, as a scholar of ancient texts, as a scholar of the Hebrew Bible, there have been, very profound transformations in scholars' understanding of the Bible, of the history of ancient Israel. In recent generations, the last 50, 100 years have seen, monumental shifts in the way scholars approach this history, the meanings of these texts in their original context, the role of early biblical interpretation. But I would say, almost none of that has filtered through to, broader public consciousness. I don't know where to lay the blame necessarily, but in my classes, for instance, I teach classes here at the University of North Carolina. I try to make these ideas accessible to my students. So my students in my, say, intro class to ancient Near East, they don't read Hebrew, they don't read any ancient languages, but that doesn't mean that a lot of these ideas, a lot of these results can't be conveyed to them in a clear way. It just takes effort, takes time. It takes kind of a willingness to kind of apply the attention to do that.
Well, another excellent reason to go out and pick up Patterns of Sin, particularly if you're a religious professional, but really if you're at all interested in just understanding a little bit more behind the language that the Bible uses about sin and the way that we should approach these metaphors and the way that they can help color our interpretation. Go out, pick it up. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. Joseph, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today, and for writing this book.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure speaking with you.
Have a nice day.